The captured German soldiers braced for punishment as they were herded into the American camp, eyes filled with fear and pride. Rumors had painted the Americans as monsters, ruthless victors who starved their enemies. But when the camp gates closed behind them, something unexpected happened. Instead of hatred, they smelled bread fresh, warm, and real. As steaming plates of food were handed out by men in U.S. uniforms, silence fell. One young German prisoner whispered, trembling, "Why would they feed us?" That night, around wooden tables, enemies broke bread, and humanity began to return. The convoy of trucks rumbled to a halt outside Camp Wheeler, Georgia, on a gray April morning in 1945. 37 German prisoners of war climbed down from the vehicles, their boots hitting American soil with the weight of defeat. Their uniforms hung loose on gaunt frames. Faces marked by sleepless nights and the shock of surrender stared at the barbed wire fence that would become their new world. Lieutenant Hans Fischer stood among them, straight-backed despite exhaustion. At 24, he'd commanded a tank division that had fought through France and held the line in the Ardennes. Now he commanded nothing but his own dignity. Around him, younger soldiers whispered nervously in German, their voices carrying the brittle edge of fear. "They'll starve us," muttered Private Otto Kraus, barely 19. "My cousin wrote from a camp in France, said they get one meal every 2 days." "Quiet," Hans ordered softly. Though he'd heard worse stories, propaganda had painted vivid pictures during the war. Americans as savage captors who delighted in cruelty, who saw German soldiers as less than human. In training, they'd been told that surrender meant torture or death. Better to fight to the last breath than fall into enemy hands. But the war had ended. The Reich had crumbled. And fighting to the last breath had given way to this standing in a muddy yard in the American South, waiting to learn their fate. The gates swung open. American soldiers lined the path, rifles ready but not raised. Their faces showed neither sympathy nor malice, just the blank efficiency of men following orders. Hans studied them carefully. Most looked young, younger even than his own men. Farm boys and factory workers. He guessed. Thrust into uniforms and shipped across an ocean to fight people they'd never met. An officer emerged from the main building, clipboard in hand. Captain William Brennan, according to the name stitched on his uniform. He was perhaps 40, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. "You will be processed," Brennan announced in clipped English. A translator stepped forward to repeat it in German. "Personal items will be catalogued, weapons and contraband confiscated. You will be assigned barracks and given regulations. Questions will be addressed after processing. No mention of food, no mention of treatment." The prisoners exchanged glances. They were separated into groups of 5 and led toward different buildings. Hans found himself between Otto and Sergeant Ernst Weber, a veteran who'd fought in North Africa before the European theater. Weber's jaw was set hard, his eyes scanning for threats. As they passed the mess hall, a smell drifted out, something baking. Hans's stomach clenched involuntarily. They hadn't eaten since the morning before, and that had been only a scrap of black bread and ersatz coffee. "Keep moving," an American soldier said, not unkindly. Hans noticed the man was black, wearing corporal stripes. Corporal James Mitchell, his name tape read. Their eyes met for a brief moment, soldier to soldier, before Hans looked away, following his group into the processing building. Inside, the real wait began. Processing took hours. Each prisoner stood before a desk where 2 Americans recorded information with methodical precision. Name, rank, unit, hometown. Questions about military service, about knowledge of war crimes, about membership in certain organizations. The translator worked tirelessly, his voice growing hoarse. Hans answered truthfully. He had nothing to hide beyond the shame of defeat. When asked about atrocities, he stated clearly that his unit had engaged in combat operations, only tanks against tanks, soldiers against soldiers. The American, taking notes, showed no reaction, simply wrote down the responses. Personal items went into manila envelopes. Hans surrendered his watch, his wedding ring, his wallet containing a photograph of his mother in Bremen. The watch had been his father's, carried through the First War and now confiscated in the Second. The American handling it turned it over carefully, then placed it in the envelope with surprising gentleness. "You'll get it back," the translator said, perhaps sensing Hans's tension. "When you're released." The word hung in the air like a promise no one could guarantee. After processing came delousing. They stripped in a cold room while powder was sprayed over their clothes and bodies. The humiliation stung worse than the chemicals. Men who had commanded respect, who had fought with courage, now stood naked and defeated, covered in white dust like ghosts of themselves. Fresh clothes followed, not uniforms, but simple cotton shirts and trousers, all dyed blue-gray. Prisoner clothes. Otto pulled his on with shaking hands, and Hans noticed tears tracking through the powder on the boy's face. "We're alive," Hans said quietly in German. "Remember that," Weber snorted nearby. For how long? Outside, the afternoon had turned cold. Guards marched them across the compound, toward long wooden barracks. Hans counted 6 buildings, each capable of housing perhaps 40 men. The camp was larger than he'd expected, better maintained. No mud pits or squalor visible, at least not from this angle. The barracks door opened to reveal rows of bunk beds, each with a thin mattress and folded blanket. A stove sat in the center, unlit. Windows lined both walls, covered with wire mesh. At the far end, a door led to what looked like a washroom. "This is yours," the guard said through the translator. "Stay inside until the evening bell. Rules will be explained then." The door closed. A lock clicked. 37 men stood in silence, processing their new reality. Some claimed beds immediately, others just sat on the floor, heads in hands. Otto curled up on a lower bunk and faced the wall. Weber paced like a caged animal. Hans chose a bed near the window and sat carefully, testing the mattress. It gave slightly under his weight, old but intact. Through the wire mesh, he could see other barracks, a recreation yard, and in the distance, what appeared to be a vegetable garden. Corporal Mitchell walked past outside, hands in his pockets, seemingly lost in thought. He glanced toward the barracks but didn't stop. The afternoon stretched into evening. No one came. No food arrived. Stomachs growled and anxiety mounted, confirming the worst fears whispered during the truck ride. The first night in captivity passed in hungry darkness. Morning came with harsh sunlight through the eastern windows. Hans woke to find he'd actually slept, though his dreams had been troubled images of burning tanks and the faces of men he'd lost mixed with the uncertainty of what came next. Around him, the other prisoners stirred. Weber was already awake, standing by the window with his arms crossed. Otto remained curled on his bunk, awake but unmoving. "Second day without food," someone muttered in German. "They're testing us, or they're waiting for us to get weaker," another replied. "Easier to control." Hans stood and stretched, trying to project a calm he didn't entirely feel. Leadership hadn't ended with surrender. These men still looked to him, still needed someone to hold them together. A bell rang outside, sharp and insistent. The lock clicked. The door swung open. An American sergeant stood there, flanked by 2 privates. Outside, he ordered. "Formation." The translator appeared, repeating the command. The prisoners filed out slowly, blinking in the brightness. Other barracks were emptying too. Hans estimated nearly 200 prisoners in total, all gathering in ragged lines in the central yard. Captain Brennan emerged from the headquarters building, clipboard still in hand. He surveyed the assembled men with an expression Hans couldn't read. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention." The translation came. "You will be treated according to international law. You will work, but not excessively. You will receive medical care. You will be permitted to send letters home, subject to censorship. Attempts to escape will result in punishment, up to and including solitary confinement." The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they felt hollow. Laws and conventions were for peacetime. They'd all seen how quickly civilized behavior dissolved under pressure. "Barracks assignments are final," Brennan continued. You will clean your quarters daily. Inspections occur without warning. Troublemakers will be dealt with swiftly. Still no mention of food. A prisoner near the front suddenly called out in broken English. "When eat?" The question echoed across the yard. Every eye turned to Brennan. The captain's expression didn't change. After this assembly, relief rippled through the ranks, though suspicion remained. What would after mean? How long would they be made to wait? The assembly continued with more rules, schedules for washing, protocols for addressing guards, consequences for various infractions. Hans tried to focus, but his attention kept drifting to the mess hall building. Smoke rose from its chimney. Something was being prepared. When Brennan finally dismissed them, the prisoners didn't move immediately. Years of military training warred with hunger and uncertainty. Which direction should they go? Corporal Mitchell stepped forward, gesturing toward the mess hall. "This way," he said simply. The translation wasn't necessary. The prisoners understood. They began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing purpose. Hans fell into step beside Weber, while Otto trailed behind like a shadow. "Whatever they give us," Weber said quietly, "eat it slowly. Your stomach's not used to food anymore." Hans nodded. Good advice. In the camps near the end, many had died not from starvation but from eating too quickly when food finally came. They approached the mess hall entrance, where the smell of bread grew stronger. The mess hall could accommodate perhaps 100 men at a time. Long tables stretched in rows, each flanked by benches worn smooth by use. At the far end, a serving line had been set up, metal trays stacked beside steaming containers. American soldiers stood behind the line, ladles and tongs in hand. Not guards with rifles, but cooks in stained aprons. The contrast was jarring. Hans's group was directed to the left side. They shuffled forward, uncertain. Otto pressed close to Hans's back, seeking security in proximity. "Plates," one of the American cooks said, gesturing. The translator repeated it. Unnecessarily, the meaning was clear. Each prisoner took a metal plate and cup from the stack. The weight of them felt substantial, real. Hans studied his plate, noting a small dent near the edge. This wasn't special prisoner equipment, these were the same plates the American soldiers used. The line moved forward. The first container held scrambled eggs, pale yellow, and still steaming. A cook scooped a generous portion onto Hans's plate, without a word. The second container, fried potatoes with onions. Another large scoop. The third, thick slices of bread. 2 pieces. The fourth, strips of bacon, crispy and glistening. Hans stared at his plate. The portions were substantial. This wasn't survival rations. This was breakfast. At the end of the line, coffee poured into his cup, dark and hot. The smell alone was almost overwhelming. He found a seat at one of the long tables, plate in hand, mind struggling to process what had just happened. Otto sat across from him, holding his plate like it might vanish. Weber took the seat beside Hans, his expression carefully neutral. Around them, other prisoners were receiving the same treatment, the same generous portions, the same quiet efficiency from the American cooks. No mockery, no cruelty, just food. "It's a trick," someone whispered in German. "They've poisoned it." Hans picked up his fork. The metal was cold against his palm. He looked at the eggs on his plate, then at Otto's frightened face, then at Corporal Mitchell, who had entered the mess hall and now leaned against the far wall, watching but not interfering. Their eyes met again. Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but something in his posture suggested patience, waiting for them to understand. Hans cut a piece of bread. The interior was soft, the crust firm. He raised it to his mouth. The taste hit him like a memory, wheat and salt and yeast, warm and real. Not sawdust, not substitute. Real bread. He chewed slowly, carefully, swallowed. His throat was tight. Across the table, Otto was crying silently, a piece of bacon halfway to his mouth. "Eat," Hans said softly in German. "It's real." One by one, The prisoners began to eat. The mess hall filled with the quiet sounds of utensils on metal plates. No conversation, just the profound act of eating food given freely by men they'd been taught to fear. Hans ate slowly, remembering Weber's advice, but also because each bite seemed to carry weight beyond mere sustenance. With every swallow, something shifted inside him, some piece of the propaganda he'd carried loosening its grip. When his plate was empty, he sat back, overwhelmed. Corporal Mitchell still stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching the room with thoughtful eyes. The second breakfast came the next morning, and the third the day after that. Consistent, substantial, real. By the fourth day, the prisoners began to accept that this wasn't an elaborate psychological game. This was simply how the camp operated. They were fed 3 times daily: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The portions weren't luxurious, but they were adequate, far exceeding what many had received in the final months of the war. Work assignments began. Groups were sent to maintain the campgrounds, to help in the kitchens, to tend the vegetable garden Hans had glimpsed from the barracks. The work was real but not brutal, 8 hours with breaks, supervised but not driven. Hans was assigned to the garden detail along with Otto and a dozen others. An American private named Robert Davies oversaw them, a lanky man from Iowa who knew farming and spoke in a slow, measured drawl that the translator struggled to match. "Tomatoes go here," Davies explained, pointing to a cleared section. "We'll build stakes for them as they grow. Beans along this row. Lettuce here, in the shade." They worked with actual tools, hoes and rakes and spades, not makeshift implements. Davies worked alongside them, his hands as dirty as theirs by midday. During a water break, Otto asked through the translator, "Why do you work with us?" Davies wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Garden needs tending. You're here. Makes sense. But we are the enemy," Otto pressed. Davies considered this, squinting into the Sunday wars over. "You lost. Now you're just folks who need to eat. Same as everyone else. Garden feeds all of us prisoners and guards alike." The simplicity of the answer seemed to confound Otto more than any complex explanation might have. That evening in the barracks, the conversation turned to this new reality. "They treat us like humans," said Private Leon Hartman, who'd been assigned to the kitchen detail. "I helped prepare dinner tonight. They showed me how they wanted the potatoes cut, not orders, instructions, like I was learning, not being punished. The medical officer examined me today," added another prisoner. "My leg wound from the surrender. He cleaned it, applied proper medicine, gave me tablets for infection. When I thanked him in German, he nodded. Just nodded." Weber remained skeptical. "They're following the rules because it's required. Nothing more. Don't mistake efficiency for kindness." But Hans wasn't so sure. He'd seen efficiency in the Wehrmacht: cold, mechanical, effective. This felt different. There was a casualness to the American approach, a lack of rigid hierarchy that seemed almost undisciplined by German standards, yet somehow it worked. More than that, there were moments small, easy to miss, where he glimpsed something beyond mere compliance with regulations. The way Corporal Mitchell had helped an elderly prisoner carry a heavy water bucket without being asked. The way Davies had patiently re-explained the planting instructions when the translator had gotten confused, showing with his hands what words couldn't convey. The way the mess hall cooks occasionally gave slightly larger portions to the prisoners who looked most gaunt, their movements subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. These weren't acts mandated by the Geneva Convention. These were choices. 3 weeks into captivity, Hans found himself working alongside Corporal Mitchell. The assignment was mundane, repairing a section of fence damaged by a storm. Hans held boards in place while Mitchell hammered nails, both men working in companionable silence broken only by occasional brief directions. "Steady there," Mitchell would say, and Hans would brace the board. "Next one," and Hans would retrieve another piece of lumber. The morning stretched into afternoon. Clouds gathered overhead, threatening rain. Mitchell worked with focused efficiency, but without urgency. When they finished a section, he stepped back to assess it, hands on hips, much the way Hans had once evaluated tank positions. During a break, they sat on the finished portion of fence, sharing water from Mitchell's canteen. The translator had moved to help another group, leaving them without a linguistic bridge. Mitchell pulled a photograph from his pocket, creased and worn. He studied it for a moment, then showed it to Hans. Two young men in civilian clothes stood beside a pickup truck, arms around each other's shoulders. Brothers. Clearly, the resemblance was unmistakable. "My brother," Mitchell said slowly, pointing to the one on the left. Then he touched his own chest. "Me." Hans nodded, understanding. Mitchell pointed to his brother again. "France. 1944. He made a gesture Hans had seen too many times, the universal sign for death, a hand cutting across the throat. "Gone." The simple word carried oceans of grief. "I'm sorry," Hans said in English, one of the few phrases he'd learned. Mitchell studied him for a long moment, as if measuring something. Then he said, "War takes from everyone." They sat in silence. Two men who'd fought on opposite sides of an ocean, who'd lost people to the same machine of violence, now sharing water and a moment of quiet understanding. Hans found himself speaking in German, knowing Mitchell wouldn't understand the words, but perhaps understanding the intent. "I lost my father in the First War. My younger brother in France. Like yours. My uncle in Russia. My best friend in the Ardennes. War has taken so much from my family that sometimes I wonder if anything remains." Mitchell's expression suggested he grasped the essence, if not the details. He nodded slowly. "Why?" Hans asked, switching to English again, struggling with the pronunciation. "Why you? Kind?" Mitchell considered the question seriously. "Because someone has to be," he finally said. "War makes us forget we're all human. Someone has to remember." He paused, then added, "My mama taught me that. Said hate's easy. Kindness takes courage." Hans absorbed this. In training, they'd been taught that kindness was weakness, that mercy was foolish, that the enemy deserved nothing but destruction. Yet here sat a man who'd lost his brother to German bullets, choosing compassion over vengeance. The rain began, light at first. They gathered their tools and headed toward the storage shed. As they walked, Hans realized something fundamental had shifted. He no longer saw an enemy soldier. He saw James Mitchell, a man from somewhere in America, who missed his brother and believed in his mother's wisdom. Just a man, like himself. Summer settled over Georgia with oppressive heat. The prisoners adapted to the rhythm of camp life. Wake, breakfast, work, lunch, work, dinner, free time, sleep. The routine became almost comfortable in its predictability. Letters began arriving from Germany. Not many. The postal system was chaos in the occupied zones, but enough to provide threads of connection to the world beyond the fence. Hans received a letter from his mother in Bremen. Her handwriting was shakier than he remembered, but her spirit remained strong. "The city is rubble, but we are rebuilding. The American soldiers here are young and homesick. They share their rations with the children. Little Greta from next door now speaks English words she learns from them. The Americans seem as eager for this war to be over as we are. They want to go home. We all want to go home. Stay safe, my son. Your father would be proud that you survived." The words about American soldiers sharing rations echoed his own experience. It seemed this kindness wasn't unique to Camp Wheeler, it was policy, or perhaps simply American nature. Hans struggled to reconcile this with the propaganda he'd absorbed for years. That evening, unable to sleep in the humid barracks, Hans pulled his harmonica from his personal effects. They'd returned small items deemed harmless: photographs, letters, musical instruments. The harmonica had been his father's, carried through the trenches of the First War and passed to Hans before the Second. He stepped outside into the warm night. A guard glanced over but didn't intervene. The camp rules allowed prisoners in the yard until lights out. Hans sat on a bench near the barracks and began to play. Nothing military, just a folk song his mother used to sing. Ich weiß nicht, was soll es bedeuten, the Lorelei song, about the Rhine and longing and home. The notes drifted across the quiet camp. In the barracks, Conversation stopped. Prisoners came to the windows, listening. Even the American guards paused in their rounds. Hans played slowly, putting into the melody all the homesickness he'd been holding inside. When he finished, he sat in silence, the harmonica still warm in his hands. Footsteps approached. Corporal Mitchell emerged from the shadows, his shift apparently just ending. "That was beautiful," Mitchell said simply. Hans understood the tone, if not all the words. "Thank you." Mitchell sat on the bench beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. For a while they just sat there, two men looking up at stars that shone over both Georgia and Germany, over battlefields and homes, indifferent to the boundaries men drew. "My brother played guitar," Mitchell said eventually. "Used to play this song, Shenandoah. About a river. About leaving home." Hans nodded, understanding the universal language of music and memory. "Play again?" Mitchell asked, gesturing to the harmonica. Hans did. This time he chose something simpler, gentler, a lullaby. Around them, the camp settled into night, and for a few minutes, the music created a space where enmity couldn't exist. When he finished, Mitchell stood. "Good night, Hans. Good night, James." First names. Another barrier crossed. August brought news that some prisoners would be released soon, those who could prove they'd never been members of certain organizations, who had families waiting, who posed no security risk. Hans qualified. His record was clean. His mother waited in Bremen. The paperwork began processing. But one afternoon, he received a second letter from his mother. This one more detailed. "I must tell you something that has changed my understanding. Last week, a team of American engineers came to our neighborhood. They're helping rebuild the water system, pumps and pipes, destroyed in the bombing. They work all day in the heat, these young men so far from home. At lunch, they share their food with anyone nearby. Yesterday, one of them, he can't be more than 20, gave his sandwich to Frau Weber's children. When she tried to refuse, saying he needed it more, he just smiled and said, 'I'll get another.' They look hungrier." Hans, I realized then that I'd been wrong about so many things. The Americans are not the monsters we were told about. They are just young men who want to go home, showing kindness because that's who they choose to be. If you meet Americans there, I hope you will see what I have seen, that we are all simply people, trying to survive and be decent." Hans read the letter 3 times. His mother's words confirmed what he'd experienced but been afraid to fully accept. The shift in perspective felt like shedding a heavy coat he'd worn so long he'd forgotten its weight. That evening, he approached Mitchell during recreation time. "I need help," Hans said in halting English. "Write letter." Mitchell understood immediately. They sat at one of the outdoor tables, Mitchell providing paper and a pen from his pocket. Hans's English wasn't strong enough for correspondence, but between his broken words and Mitchell's patient questions, they constructed a reply to his mother. "Tell her." Hans struggled. "Tell her I understand. The Americans here, good men. Like she sees." Mitchell wrote carefully, translating Hans's thoughts into proper English with surprising sensitivity. When they finished, Hans signed his name at the bottom, his handwriting tight with emotion. "Thank you, James," he said quietly. "You're welcome, Hans." Mitchell paused, then added, "My mama sent me a letter too. Asked if I was staying human out here, or if the war was making me hard. I wrote back and told her about the prisoners, how you work hard, how you're just men like us." She wrote again, saying she was proud. Said that's what my brother would have wanted, for me to remember who I am. Hans absorbed this. "Your brother. He would be proud of you." Mitchell's eyes glistened. "I hope so. I really do." They sat together as the sun set. Two men who'd been enemies by accident of birth, now connected by something stronger than national boundaries. The simple recognition of shared humanity, the courage to forgive, and the wisdom to see beyond the uniforms. September arrived with cooler mornings and the first hints of autumn in the air. Release orders came through for Hans and 17 other prisoners. The paperwork was completed at the administration building. Hans would travel by train to a port city, then by ship back to Europe, then somehow make his way through the occupied zones to Bremen. The journey would take weeks, but at least it would lead home. His last night in the barracks was bittersweet. Otto had been cleared for release too, but Weber would remain. His village was in the Soviet sector, and repatriation there was complicated. They shared a final meal together in the mess hall, the three of them and several others who'd formed bonds during captivity. "Take care of your mother," Weber said gruffly to Hans. "Build something good in the rubble." "I will," Hans promised. "And you?" Weber shrugged. "I'll survive. I always do." But his eyes betrayed his uncertainty about what awaited in the Soviet zone. In the morning, the prisoners being released assembled in the yard one last time. Their personal effects were returned: watches, rings, photographs, letters. Hans slipped his father's watch onto his wrist, feeling its familiar weight. Captain Brennan addressed them formally, wishing them safe travels and reminding them that they were now civilians, expected to contribute to rebuilding a peaceful Europe. The translator conveyed his words precisely. Then, informally, Brennan added, "You've conducted yourselves with dignity here. I hope you'll remember that Americans can be fair, even to former enemies." The German translation brought nods from several prisoners. As they prepared to board the trucks that would take them to the train station, Hans found Mitchell waiting by the vehicle. "Came to say goodbye," Mitchell said. Hans extended his hand. Mitchell shook it firmly. "You showed me something important, James," Hans said in carefully practiced English. "You showed me that war does not have to destroy who we are, that we can choose to be human, even when everything tells us to hate." Mitchell smiled. "You showed me the same thing, Hans, that the men on the other side weren't monsters. Just soldiers, following orders, trying to survive, missing home. My hate died here, in this camp. I'm grateful for that." They stood for a moment, hands clasped, bridging the gap between former enemies. "Maybe someday," Hans said, "I can visit America, see your home, and maybe I'll visit Germany," Mitchell replied. "See the Rhine you played songs about. You would be welcome. So would you." The truck engine started. Hans climbed aboard, taking a seat by the window. As the vehicle pulled away, he watched Mitchell standing in the yard, one hand raised in farewell. Hans raised his own hand in response. The camp gates opened, then closed behind them. Hans was free, carrying memories that would shape the rest of his life, not of cruelty and vengeance, but of unexpected kindness and the triumph of humanity over hatred. 23 years later, in a classroom in Bremen, Professor Hans Fischer stood before a group of university students studying post-war history. His hair had grayed, his face lined by time, but his eyes remained sharp and thoughtful. Behind him, the chalkboard held a timeline of World War II. Before him, young Germans born after the war, the generation that would inherit the responsibility of remembering without perpetuating hatred. "Today we'll discuss something not often found in textbooks," Hans began. "The treatment of prisoners of war and what it reveals about national character." He told them about Camp Wheeler, about arriving, defeated and terrified, expecting cruelty, finding instead a hot breakfast, about Corporal James Mitchell, who'd lost his brother to German fire but chose compassion over revenge, about working in gardens, repairing fences, and learning that former enemies could recognize each other's humanity. "Why does this matter?" a student asked. "It's been decades. We've moved on." Hans leaned against his desk. "Because how we treat our enemies when we're victorious reveals who we truly are. The Americans could have been cruel. They had every justification. We'd started a war that killed millions, destroyed cities, committed atrocities, yet they chose to feed us, to work beside us, to see us as human beings deserving of dignity." He paused, letting that sink in. "I learned more about morality in that prison camp than in all my years of service. I learned that true strength isn't domination. It's having the power to destroy your enemy and choosing mercy instead. The Americans taught me that, not with lectures, but with bread and coffee and simple human decency." After class, a student lingered. "Professor, do you ever wonder what happened to the corporal? The one you mentioned?" Hans smiled and walked to his office bookshelf. From it, he pulled a photograph in a simple frame. Two men in their 40s standing together beside a familiar river, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning. "James Mitchell visited 5 years ago," Hans said. He'd become a teacher too, in Georgia. We corresponded for years after the war, and finally, he and his wife traveled to Europe. I showed him the Rhine. We drank beer in Munich and wine in the Black Forest. His wife and mine became friends. Our children played together. That's remarkable, the student said softly. What's remarkable, Hans corrected, is that it should seem remarkable. This should be normal, former enemies becoming friends, recognizing that national boundaries are accidents of birth, that we're all fundamentally the same. The tragedy isn't that James and I found friendship. The tragedy is that we had to become enemies first. He set the photograph back on the shelf beside another image, the old one from Camp Wheeler, faded now, showing a young German prisoner and an American corporal sharing a bench on a warm night, a harmonica between them. The war taught me to fight, Hans concluded, but peace taught me to live. And I learned the first lesson of peace from a man who had every reason to hate me, but chose to offer bread instead. On his desk, a letter lay waiting to be mailed, his monthly correspondence with James, continuing a conversation that had begun with silent recognition across a prison camp fence and had grown into a lifelong bond. Outside, Bremen had been rebuilt. The scars of war remained visible if you knew where to look. But life had returned, cafes bustling, children playing, people moving forward while carrying the weight of memory. Hans looked out his window at the city his mother had described in her letters, rubble transformed into renewal. The Americans had helped rebuild it, just as they'd helped rebuild him in that Georgia camp, one act of kindness at a time. That evening, he would write to James, as he did every month. He would tell him about the class, about the students' questions, about how their story still mattered all these years later. And James would write back, as he always did, with news from Georgia and memories of that strange summer when enemies learned to break bread together. The letters would continue, a testament to the truth that had saved both their souls, that humanity can survive even the worst that humans do to each other, if we have the courage to choose it.